my privilege to introduce two remarkable speakers who will lead today's discussion on why communism failed. First, we have Jasper Becker, an acclaimed journalist, author, and an expert on Asian affairs. With decades of experience and groundbreaking works like Hungry Ghost, Mao's Secret Famine, Jasper brings unparalleled insight into the historical and societal dimensions of communication.
The starting point that I should introduce Jasper. You've heard about his stay in China. He's reported in China for more than 2 decades. I rarely have met somebody who's lived that long in China and survived. Though later on he was asked to leave, and it's a very interesting story. He's also done many other books, particularly one on the famines in China and how they led to millions of deaths in the 20th century. I think before we start, I have many questions after speed reading your book, because I was asked just a few weeks ago to be on this panel with you. I think it would be great if you tell us about how this book brewed and came into shape as it is. While it's a scathing critique of the communist model of the Soviet Union, but it's also so well informed and packed with data that often, one is sort of startled. So maybe you can talk a bit about that, and then we can have a follow-up discussion.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me here and for coming along to listen to this discussion. In my lifetime, the biggest events were the Chinese democracy movement in 1989, followed by the fall of the Berlin Wall a year later, then the banning of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And these events took everyone completely by surprise. Not only all the CIA intelligence officers, also the leaders in those countries themselves never expected any of these things to happen. And certainly not the academics who specialized in Soviet studies or Chinese studies. It was an extraordinary intelligence failure, because the CIA, which had this budget of hundreds of millions of dollars, was set up purposely at the beginning of the Cold War to study the Soviet Union. And they were still convinced that the Communist Party would continue to rule the Soviet Union for the indefinite future. And there was a famous book on economics by somebody called Samuelson, which almost every economics undergraduate studied in the United States and elsewhere. I think 4 million copies were sold to students over 30 years. And in that book, this famous economist, I think he's still alive, always predicted that it was inevitable that the Soviet Union would overtake the United States, and it was going to be in 10 years or 15 years. But it was regarded as a dead certainty, because he and other people argued that the Soviet Union, using technocratic knowledge and central planning, would allocate resources in a far more rational way than in a market economy, which was where people act driven by irrational impulses and by crazy politics and all kinds of things. And then suddenly, when these societies collapsed and were forced to make huge changes, everybody began to question why these people got these things so wrong. And at the time, I'd spent my first period in China, and I'd been able to witness at first hand the transformation of the Chinese economy as they began to dismantle prices and wage controls. And they started off in the agricultural sector, And suddenly, where there'd once been a shortage of pork or eggs or cabbages, suddenly there were markets, peasants were bringing food to the cities, and you began to get an abundance of products which had previously been in short supply. And I remember I had this Chinese teacher who used to come once a week, who had lived in China for 30 years. And what he always wanted from me was that I serve him some eggs, because he said for decades he was only allowed to eat one egg a month. So this was a kind of extraordinary thing to see. And shortly after that, I started researching the history of Chinese agriculture and the reasons between the Great Leap Forward, which was between 1958 and 1962. And in that period, something like 30, 40, maybe 50 million people died because of what was clearly a man-made famine. So I wrote this book called Hungry Ghosts, and in it I described what happened in China. And one of the key things which emerged from that was that the Chinese leadership kind of fooled themselves into thinking that their policies were creating an abundance of agricultural wealth for the country and were producing these fantastic record harvests, when in actual fact the country was starving to death. And but the statistics produced by the State Statistical Office kept reporting these fantastic harvests, and they were actually allowing people to eat as much as they want and for free in communal halls, eating halls. So that book was not so much about economic theory, but about what actually happened, describing the famine and the politics around it. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, I had a job which allowed me to travel around the Soviet Union quite a bit. And one of the things that struck me was that when people wrote about China or wrote about the Soviet Union, they always seemed to believe that the way people behaved in these two very different cultures was in fact due to the culture. And that when I traveled around these countries, I actually found that people in the Soviet Union and in China were behaving or in almost identical ways because they were living under the same economic and political system. And so I think the role of culture, I began to feel the role of culture and history was exaggerated. And it was really people's behavior were more determined by these economic policies. And that led me to try and understand what exactly was it about these economic policies which led them to result, instead of an increase in people's wealth, in actual famines where people starved to death. And so when you write about other countries, say part of my book is about East Germany, why that failed. And people said, oh, that's because of the, East Germany was like this because of the Prussians and Protestantism, or, a tradition of autocracy or something or other. And in China, they would say, oh, it's all about the legalist philosophy of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi. Or in Russia, they would go on, people behave like that because of the Russian soul and the Mongol Tartar yoke. Anyway, and this was a sort of kind of common theory that the reason people were poor was because of their culture and history, which were kind of chains which stopped them from becoming wealthy. And so in response to the failure of the Great Leap Forward, Mao launched something called the Cultural Revolution, and there were all these red guards running around destroying everything from the past, because he blamed the failure of his economic policies on the legacy of 2,000 or 5,000 years of Chinese history. And so he was determined that all traces of the past, people's customs and thinkings, should be smashed, and they should start with a clean slate. And actually what I saw happening in China was that the mere fact that you lifted prices and wage controls and all kinds of government restrictions on economic activity was quite enough to stimulate economic growth. And suddenly there were restaurants springing up, people could travel around, they could eat as much, and later on that spread to other parts of the economy. So it was clear that this had nothing to do with history or culture, and the same applied in Russia. And so this sort of cultural revolution type theory seemed to me to be quite unhelpful in understanding what happens in societies. And so I was then back in England and began to read more about economic theory to try and understand this. And I discovered there was something which was called the Austrian School of Economics, which was developed by a number of professors at the end of the 19th century, the early 20th century, at the University of Vienna. And there were a number of professors there. And one of them was called Ludwig von Mises. And he was one of the great leaders of the Vienna School of Economics. So the reason they called this is because a lot of economic theory was discussed in German, and there were basically two schools. One which was pretty Marxist, which was in Berlin, and one which was market-orientated, which was in Vienna. And later on, these professors emigrated to the United States, and this debate continued in the United States. So the Austrian School of Economics is also called the monetarist school of economics, or the right-wing school of economics. And basically the two schools differ. So the Marxist school believes that in the past 10,000 years ago, we were living in communal societies where we shared property. And Marx and Engels were particularly interested in the Red Indian societies. And the Austrian School of Economics was more about trying to understand where money came from, what its role was. And at one point in the distant past, they believed we lived in a market economy, and we adopted gold as a means of calculating the value of different goods. So if people on one side of the valley had too many goats, and people on the other side of the mountain had too much fish, so they had to trade with each other. And the more goods that were being traded, the more you needed a universal means of counting, a numeraire. And that was gold, because it was shiny, it didn't go bad, you could divide it easily, and there wasn't much of it. It was of limited supply. So this was their theory. And so this guy, Ludwig von Mises, developed this theory of the socialist calculation problem, which when I lived in China and wrote about these countries for many years, I'd never heard of. Nobody talked about it very much. Mm-hmm. But the socialist calculation states that when you abolish money as Lenin did after the 1917 revolution, or Mao did in China, and you introduce a centrally planned economy, you have to have something which you can count in order to make a plan. What are you actually calculating in order to determine whether your efforts or investments are going to be rewarded with extra output? So in a market economy where you have private property, two individuals agree on the value of something according to their own belief, which is also called the marginal utility theory, of what they value more. So if you've got more goats, you don't value them very highly because you've got loads of them. And if you've got fish, you don't value them. But if you have a shortage of fish, then you're in a different situation. So this was the basic of the difference. And the Marxist theory was that the value of something was determined not by the respective wishes of the individual, but by the amount of labor that went into producing it. So they came at this from different angles. So the socialist calculation problem is that Ludwig von Mises developed was that what happens when you abolish banks and money and private property? How do you create a plan? What are you counting? So you end up counting things by their weight or their number. So how much steel, how much electricity, how much wool was measured in quantity and not according to how much people valued it. So, for instance, when I traveled around Mongolia, people grew a lot of cashmere goats. And under the Soviet system, the centrally planned system, they bred the goats to have coarser and coarser hair because it weighed more and it was easier to fulfill the plan. Where, of course, if you want to have a nice shawl made of goat's hair, you want the finest, tenderest hair. So this kind of contradictions were inherent in this. And then when you set targets and quotas for quantities, it's easy to falsify these statistics and make them up because you are compelled to meet these quotas, otherwise you will lose your job or even go to jail. And it also meant that when you look at things in terms of the amount of labor, you want the cheapest kind of labor. So that's why you have a gulag system where you pay the minimum amount to feed and clothe your workforce. So this is the kind of issues that I looked at in the book. And although these events 35 years ago are not so prominent in people's minds these days, I would argue that many of the repercussions of this theory and the way it was applied around the world are still with us today.
Right. Thank you, Jasper. I mean, that leads us to the discussion because the underlying theme in your book, particularly with respect to 20th century, was how Soviet Union's data or the numbers they were projecting about their economy, their growth, their development were unreliable. And the CIA, whom you critique a lot in the book, citing many other sources as well, were kind of under the impression that the Soviet Union was rising and is going to take over the US. So how did it all happen? Was it the effective propaganda of the communist regimes that they could convince the world that they were rising and shining? Or was it also the material change? Because Russia, before the revolution, was a peasant society by and large, with pockets of industry here and there. But it did undergo industrialization. It did undergo development of an industrial base. So there was some material sort of evidence there. But how did they manage to do that for so long? That's my question for 5 or 6 decades.
Yeah, so this was the argument of Samuelson and a lot of these people and professors in Harvard and their disciples who went to work at the CIA, they would say, well, the Soviet Union exists, and it's a very big, powerful country with a strong military. They have lots of good weapons, where they're a superpower. And so what was behind all this? Well, so first of all, going back to the statistics, a lot of the statistics produced inside the Soviet Union for their own consumption were fake. So that's one thing that emerged. The second thing is they kept the true nature of the Soviet economy hidden from the world. And in fact, they stopped producing their own 5-year plans. There were actually no plans. They just made things up on the hoof. And secondly, when you have a socialist calculation problem, you actually don't know whether your investments are returning the investment that you put into it. So what you get is what the Austrians call malinvestment. So the Soviet Gulag prisoners built lots of railways to nowhere. And so a lot of the investment was misspent. And the biggest thing that they misspent money on, and the real reason these societies collapsed, is because after the end of the Cold War, we discovered that the Soviet Union was devoting about 30 or 35% of its economy, of its resources, into the military. So they accumulated something like 80,000 tanks and armored personnel carriers, which are the armored personnel carriers and tanks which are being destroyed in the war between Russia and Ukraine at the moment. They just had enormous stockpiles of this stuff. And the leadership themselves had no idea of how much money was being devoted to the military-industrial complex. So in a normal economy, you're devoting between 2 and 5%. And then the CIA kind of gradually raised it. They began to get more intelligence from defectors and whatnot. So then they started saying, oh, maybe it's 7%. Then it went up to 12%. Then at the end of the Cold War, we were thinking, actually, these guys could be spending 15%. But it was actually a third of the economy. And the same thing happened in China. The Maoist state devoted something like 30 or 40% of its GDP to the military. They built up enormous amounts of quantities of weapons. I mean, the technology was poor, but and when I went to China in the 80s, everyone was dressed in a uniform. So this is one of the major distortions of these economies, that they themselves couldn't understand what was going on. And when I went to these economies, I thought they had like 2 sets of books, one for propaganda and then another set of hidden books where they actually knew what was going on. But I discovered this was not the case. They had no idea what they were doing.
So coming back to Soviet Union, would you say, I mean, that's the argument that you talk about, the defense spending, all the nuclear warheads at the time of the fall of Berlin Wall, that the high military expenditure contributed to the fall of Soviet empire.
Yeah, well, it's the prime example of malinvestment when you don't know. A lot of this investment was completely useless because in the end, it didn't stop the Soviet Union from going bankrupt because they had, vast numbers of tanks, but they didn't have enough to eat. So they relied on the West to sell them food, and they started and the only way they could finance the imports of the things they needed was by selling raw materials like oil, gas, and timber, things where quality didn't matter, only quantity, and things they could actually count. So they couldn't produce any consumer goods at a competitive rate. So the Soviet Union and China became reliant on imports of food, and they attempted to finance that by exporting raw materials. So in the 30s, they discovered these gold fields in the Russian Far East, these Kolyma gold fields. So they exported gold. And later on in the 70s, when the economy was about to collapse, they started producing oil and gas and building these pipelines, and that kept it going. And so the successor state, Russia, has since then depended on these exports of oil and gas to keep going.
Right. So by 80s and 90s, Soviet Union was going bankrupt, internally exploding. And the picture you paint in the book is all the food shortages, all the economic turmoil. But China, on the other hand, despite all the history that you recount in terms of famines and price controls, etc., had embarked on an ambitious reform program under Deng Xiaoping in the 80s. And so the trajectory became different. And that's why the Chinese communist model, by adapting to perhaps the flaws of the initial model, has been able to now not only survive but rise as an economic power. I mean, how would you comment on that? Because you've lived there, particularly in terms of the Chinese miracle of addressing millions of poor people and lifting them out of absolute poverty. That has been something that the world has been talking about. I mean, including in Pakistan, we look at the Chinese example and we cite it as a successful model where millions of poor have been, their lives have changed.
Yes, so I think we all know this story. So what actually happened? Well, the first thing Deng Xiaoping did when he came to power after the death of Mao was to drastically slash military spending. He allowed all the state enterprises which built all these tanks and airplanes and whatnot to go bust, and he sold off shares. And he forced them to go into the market economy, and he attracted investment to create an export business. And although China doesn't have the oil and gas that Russia does, it had a vast amount of cheap labor. So he was able to utilize that. And he and the problem that all these countries face when you dismantle a state-run, centrally planned economy is that when you have an economy of shortages and you lift the controls and you let everybody do what they want, you unleash hyperinflation. You basically then have to go back to a real economy with a real currency. And the price of that is 2 or 3 years of shock therapy, hyperinflation, and you can't escape that. So that means that you're going to become extremely unpopular. But the countries which did this very successfully, like Poland, have thrived. Other countries which didn't do this, although they were very similar, like Ukraine, had much more problems. And China chose a path of avoiding shock therapy. They didn't want hyperinflation. So what they embarked on was a gradual dismantling of price controls over 30 or 40 years. And they didn't move to establishing a real currency. So the currency in China is artificially protected. It is not a hard currency. You cannot exchange it. So there are all these capital controls. And there are also enormous amounts of controls on people's movement and freedom of speech and property rights and so on. So, so what are the actual consequences of that? Well, it became a massive industrial power, a massive export economy, but it also, because of the question about the currency, you couldn't actually properly evaluate the value of their investments. So you have a lot of malinvestment in China. So vast amounts of money have gone into building railways and apartment blocks that have now crashed the economy. So they have enormous debts, and the Chinese model is now in a very difficult place. So they've done a lot of things right, but they've also done a lot of things wrong.
Okay, that's really helpful. So, but I do want to get back to Soviet Union's trajectory. So, one of the things that I felt that perhaps I would talk to you about was that after the fall of communism in Soviet Union and that whole decade of shock therapy and economic meltdown, the average life expectancy declined. The Soviet Union had, healthcare, housing, other things taken care of, which either became privatized or became absent, and there was a hardship period for more than a decade. So, don't you think that the Soviet model, despite all its flaws and the falsification of numbers that you very assiduously record, was providing certain basic necessities to the people, like housing, heating, healthcare, education, because it was also a very, very, I mean, the literacy rate, higher education rates were pretty high. I mean, again, the numbers are what we read from the Soviet official documents, but was that not a redeeming feature, you would say?
Yes, this is something that is often raised, and a lot of people believe that. My personal experience of going around the Soviet Union, I went to all the stands in the Soviet Union. I went to the Russian Far East. I went to St. Petersburg and Moscow, and everything was in a completely dilapidated state. The healthcare was atrocious. There simply wasn't enough to buy anywhere. And I think this was an illusion. And what they actually did was to keep people happy, was they essentially pretended to pay people. So you couldn't buy anything with this money because there weren't any consumer goods, because everything was going into making tanks. So everybody accumulated, and this was true in China, an enormous amount of savings of a worthless currency. It's worthless because you can't buy anything with it. So this was a hidden inflation. And the quality of the housing, the cars, the healthcare was extremely poor compared to almost any country. So the numbers didn't really tell you the true story. And the basic thing is they couldn't provide the food that people needed. That's the basic resource that you need. Any government has to provide. So, and this was very much the same in China. People were incredibly poor, but they had these large savings. And when you started the reforms, everybody tried to spend their savings on the limited amount of goods that were available. And then within a few years, there was no longer a shortage of eggs or chickens. And that gradually, then there was no longer a shortage of clothing. Then there was no longer a shortage of bicycles. And then there was no longer a shortage of housing. And now they have too much. So I don't think what actually you discovered when you got to know places like Russia and China was that these pensions and welfare benefits that were so admired were only given to a very small part of the population who were loyal to the Communist Party. So people in the military, in the security, and certain groups who worked in key factories. And they had a very good cradle to grave welfare system.
Right.
But this was only for, like 10, 20% of the population.
So it wasn't universal in nature. Is that what you're saying?
No.
Okay. Well, I just have two more questions because then I'd like to open it up for Q&A. First is coming to the contemporary times and the rise of Vladimir Putin, who's like the sort of the uncrowned autocrat of Russia. How far is he a continuation of the communist system that you describe in detail in terms of his control over the intelligence services? He was a creature of the Russian KGB itself, and his control over different, the society, the politics, the state structures. I mean, is there departure, or is it like old wine in a new sort of bottle?
Well, there are different ways of looking at it. So let's start with, because this book is about economics more. The one thing where the state retained control over prices and ownership after the fall of the Soviet Union was the most lucrative thing, which was the export of oil and gas. So that depended on some Western technology, but it's basically something which flourished in the Soviet system. So crude oil or gas doesn't depend on any quality control or anything. It's simply you get it out of the ground and you ship it to a Western market where it has a market value. So this was not privatized, and the KGB type elite, which he belonged to, continued controlling this. So there was a big difference between domestic and international prices for these projects. And he used this money to create a kind of prosperity in Russia, because it allowed them to import a lot of consumer goods. And secondly, it allowed him to rebuild the military and to try and reconquer the former Soviet empire. And that's his personal desire to do this. He feels this is important. And why he feels that important is, as he often explains, Russia has this special destiny and this is Russian culture and blah, blah, blah. So that's his personal choice.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, before I open it up, just one question. I mean, after you wrote this book, what sort of response did you get? Were you accused of being biased because you were from England? And after all, England played a big role in the architecture of Cold War.
Well, I have to say it was extremely difficult to get this book published by university presses, because what they do is they send it around to people on the left and the right, and they've got to get a consensus. So if people on the left, economists, don't like this to be known, they will veto it. And, so the problem is most economists and intellectuals, and this is something Ludwig von Mises wrote about during his career, they are inherently inclined to central planning, because in order to be involved in a rational, logical kind of central planning system, you need to have a PhD, you need to have lots of qualifications. It's a very difficult thing to do.
Right.
You have to gather all this data, you have to interpret it, you have to consult all these people. There are lots of committees, and politicians are very interested because they want to control more resources, have more power. And if you're in a market economy, you don't need all these people. You don't need a degree. You don't even need to go to school in order to thrive in a market economy, because it's quite obvious if there's a shortage of something, the price will go up. and, you know, making people welcome and so on. So in China, for instance, what I'm talking about is after in the 1980s when they started happening, people hadn't had any proper schooling for nearly 20 years. And all those people came back to the cities and they all started businesses and all the peasants started making loads of money. And you don't need an education to thrive in a market economy. I mean, you need an education to do some technology, but you don't need any special professional licensing system. So that's the great appeal about it is you can actually do an awful lot by the government just stepping aside and allowing people to do what comes naturally.
Right. Thank you, Jasper. And before I open it up, I do want to say something that really intrigued me was how the British education covers the communist glories and successes. Because in Pakistan, there was a big clampdown on the left and the Communist Party and other left movements. And, you know, there was a complete, like, decades of vilification as opposed to, so I guess in that sense, Great Britain has a different set of education because Jasper has very meticulously documented what the O-level students, A-level students, even the study guides teach kids about collectivization, Stalin, Lenin, and all the other achievements of the Soviet Empire. But anyway, I have a lot to ask and I have a lot to critique as well, but we are limited by time, so I'll invite people here to ask questions. Yeah, okay, you can start. So please keep your question very short.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Good evening, sir. Welcome to Pakistan.
Thank you.
Sir, the fall of Russia and the eventual decline of Chinese economy as we are seeing it now, or the stagnation, what you want to call it, as you wish. But is it a flaw in the communist economics or a flaw in the leadership of USSR or Chinese leadership?
Well, I think the Chinese communists are Chinese communists, so they believe in state control. And the concession to a market economy was supposed to be a temporary concession. And so the inclination of the current Chinese leadership is to re-establish a centrally planned economy. So they don't really like these very rich plutocrats running things. So there's kind of conflict there. And they misdirected a lot of money into the wrong kind of projects. So that's their ideology, and they're following it, and then they talk about it openly. So sorry. And what was the other?
Leadership or the communist model? What is responsible for the stagnation and fall?
Well, in these countries, the leadership and the ideology are the same problem, if you see what I mean. It's not, I mean, when I was studying these countries, people always talked about the family background or personality defects of Hitler or Stalin or Mao, and tried to explain because they had an unhappy marriage or whatever, or they went to the wrong school, or somebody did them a bad turn. You know, I don't think that's a very useful thing to do. And a lot of people spend an awful lot of time studying the patronage systems in China and in Russia, who was standing next to whom at some podium and all this kind of thing. I don't think this is it's kind of entertaining, but it's not very helpful, because what you want to know is how do people change their circumstances and improve it, and what is the best method to do with it. That's kind of what we're looking for
Right.
when we study these countries.
Right. Okay.
I was going to ask.
Oh, okay. You can go ahead. Yeah.
This is working. It surprises me when you say that the Chinese economy is not doing that well. I mean, we've all been told that it's doing great, and the US, for one, is pretty terrified of it. in different ways. So why would you say, I mean, if I understood correctly, you said that they had spent too much on construction of flats or what, and I mean, I'm not quite clear why you say it's doing that.
So what the reason the Chinese economy is in the difficult situation is very similar to the Japanese economy in the past. So they do produce a lot of very excellent products, and people work very hard. But a lot of the money has gone into building excess housing. So they've got about enough housing which is standing empty to house the entire population of the European Union. 500 million people could go and live in these empty apartment blocks. So the banks have lent money to these houses, to build these houses, which are essentially worthless. So that means the banks are also worthless, and the only way you can get out of these debts is by devaluing the currency and destroying people's savings. And most people in China have invested in this property. So it's an enormous property bubble, and all the property companies which are listed in Hong Kong and China have lost 90% of their value. And in fact, all the stock market in Hong Kong and China is now worth what it was 20 years ago. So the country is essentially bust. And they try and control this by trying to stop people from taking money out of the country. And but nobody is willing to buy or sell, and because they would have to sell their property at a loss. So eventually the prices will come down, the currency will be devalued, and you'll have a lot of inflation. So this doesn't mean they aren't going to produce good cars or whatever, but as an economic system, it's state-directed malinvestment. And if you look at a lot of other things in China, like the wonderful high-speed railways, none of those railways make any money. They will never make any money. They're just vanity projects. So a lot of the money has been misspent in China, and it's kind of bust. And it's not the only country which has done this. The United States is also in a very similar situation.
Yeah. It's getting bust. Yes. So first, this gentleman, I'll come back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, I just wanted to ask, are you affiliated with the CIA by any chance?
No, I have nothing to do with the CIA.
I'm just kidding. My first question is with regards to...
Only one question, please.
Gigi. The land reform initiatives that took place in China in particular under the Mao administration, what role did they play in decentralizing the economy and sort of coming up with a system for producing inputs for the manufacturing sector, which they could then export? What role did that play in the economy and in their integration into the global economy?
Well, the problem with the Chinese rural reform is they've came to power promising to abolish landlords and give people the tenants, so to speak, their own land, which they did, and then a couple of years later they took away the land and put them into collective farms or communes, as they called them. And then when Deng came to power, he said you can have the land, but only for 15 years. That's the leasehold farming system. And they've now extended this to 30 or 40 years. But essentially all the land in China is still owned by the state, which means that it's owned by the Communist Party, and it has an army and a police which is loyal only to the Communist Party. So that means that the buildings, all these empty apartments and the ones which are not empty, you don't actually own the land underneath it. So they can take it away at any time or tax it. So that was sufficient to produce a surplus of food, and that allowed people to reinvest their capital that they'd earned, their savings, into lots of small rural enterprises. And these have done very well, and some of them have become very, very big.
Okay. Thank you, Jasper. So, young lady at the back, yeah.
Hello. So my question to our respected guest is that your book is titled "Why Communism Failed," but has it? Because why is it that we go back in time and see particular instances of failed communism and say, oh, see, it has failed, but there is a plethora of countries with with capitalistic democracies which have also failed. So why is that? Do you think that fundamental communist values have also failed? Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure what exactly the question is.
The ideological side, so the values of communism, redistribution, equality, equal access to capital, right? That's what you mean, huh?
Yes, I think the trouble is that there's kind of misunderstanding about things. Communism is something you have to construct artificially because it's centrally planned, and it means that the state controls all the resources and distributes them. So that is only that requires a large kind of infrastructure to do that. Whereas the market economy can exist on any level. You can be living in quite a small agricultural society, or you can be living on some scattered islands, and you can have a market economy, or you can be talking about the New York Stock Exchange and a big industrial modern economy. It's just allowing people to buy and sell and save at their own volition, and and what you choose to do with your excess savings or your time is entirely up to you. So some societies will go around building lots of pyramids, others will produce fantastic works of art, others will produce tens of thousands of tanks. The capitalism doesn't come with any inherent values. Whereas once you have a state-controlled society, the state has to explain and justify what it is doing with all these resources. So there's sort of two completely different concepts, really.
Okay, so young man here, and then we'll just last two questions because.
Hello, sir. I would like to build upon the second question that was asked by the. China recently is saving its face by the economic performance that has been done. Like I was reading an article in The Economist that the Chinese government is holding the financial information of its companies, and the thing you mentioned that we have been told to be afraid of Chinese people, that they're going to take over the US economy. So I would like to ask the question that will the Chinese economy will ever take over the US economy, because the debt ceiling was the debt ceiling was fulfilled in 2023 by as published by the American authorities. So the question I summarized, the question I really want to ask this: will the Chinese government or the Chinese economy take over the US economy, if it will ever happen?
No, I don't think this kind of talk is very helpful. The Americans and Chinese are mutually dependent on each other. They have a very strong economic relationship. And I think the United States has been the guarantor of international commerce through its huge navy since the end of the Second World War. So that means it protects everybody against privacy, and people can trade with each other in security. And so I think that that's going to continue. I think the problem, once you have a centralized party like the Chinese Communist Party, is that they, in order to justify their absolute control over many aspects of that country. They need to provide a justification for this. And so in China, the justification is that the foreigners, usually that means the Westerners, have in the past harmed China, and we need to avenge that. So and we and the foreigners divided the country, and we need to unify everybody who is Chinese under one regime. You know, we can't have people living in alternate Chinese societies.
Right.
So this is their ideology. So it doesn't really matter what the Chinese do, or what the Americans do, or anybody else does to the Chinese. They nurture this hostility to the foreigners and blame them for their troubles. So they're still going on about the Japanese or what the British did in the Opium War, and that's all kind of ridiculous. And they're also ignore the things that they did to other foreign countries themselves.
Right.
So this is kind of
But Jasper,
this is inherited. And just going back to Russia, this was the same thing. They needed to Putin needed to continually keep blaming the foreigners for all their problems in order to justify what he was doing. And all these arguments, they don't really bear much scrutiny. They're all a bit nonsensical.
yeah, that's true. But I just wanted to add. But everybody does that. Trump blames China and Mexicans for taking away jobs. In Europe, you have this huge issue with the immigrants. They're taking away jobs. They're bringing. So I guess we can't limit that to the Chinese or the Russians per se. It's also pretty universal. I mean, we do it here as well to outsiders all the time.
The kind of just to go back to the Austrian school. So in the Austrian school, that is what used to be called liberalism. The Austrian economists and people on that side of the spectrum, they don't believe in having these states. They don't believe in these barriers, and they just said people should be allowed to do what they want. So if you're looking at it from an Austrian point of view, these people are saying things which are not justified by their philosophy.
Right. Okay, we are out of time. But anyway, quick. Just your question, and then you have a minute, Jasper, and then we have to. I'm sorry, we are out of time. You can talk to him later.
Yeah. So I just there was this comment you made about Putin and his desires, right? But the great scholars of today disagree with you. John Mearsheimer, Jeffrey Sachs, they say Putin has no desire to bring back the Soviet glory. Russia is a great power. Great powers create buffers. United States has the Monroe Doctrine. Now, if NATO is going to bring nuclear weapons to the throat of Russia, do you just expect Russia not to react? And you know, this kind of thing that we are mind readers, we can read the mind of this dictator and that dictator, and let's go and destroy this country and that country. And this is absurd.
Okay.
There is no evidence.
I guess. Let me respond.
So what you're talking about is the theory of how states should deal with each other, in which big powers have spheres of influence and tributary states, and this kind of way of thinking and behavior has been around for thousands of years. The Chinese sort of institutionalized this with the whole strata of tributary states and so on, and rules about diplomacy and gift giving, and people had to send their children, you know, like the Thai kings would have to send their children as hostages to the emperor's court and so on. That's the kind of thing they were thinking, so that Ukraine was always part of the Russian sphere of influence, and you know, the Ukrainians themselves have no right to decide where they want to be and who their friends are, and so this is the sort of that there is a group of people who look at everything through this view, which can be quite helpful, but it's not really what I'm talking about in my book, which is more about how do what kind of philosophy allows countries to become prosperous, and how do people themselves raise their living standards through their own efforts and through the use of technology, and how do they develop new technologies. So I'm more looking at this kind of thing. This whole system of tributary states and big powers is not really what I'm very interested in.
Okay, well, I guess we'll have to end this great session. Thank you, Jasper, for all the
much.
ideas, and thank you for the questions. Give him a big hand. I had hoped that some comrades would be here and they would challenge, but sadly, comrades are missing in action like the rest of the country. Well, one comrade did challenge. Well, one was enough. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Jasper.
Thank you very much.